A minute now, and I'm talking about the borders of the colonies, because borders are important places. Because they're where cultures come into conflict. They're often where change takes place, and things like conflicts and wars begin. Uh, the British were clearly weaker in the New World than the Spanish. The Spanish were overwhelmingly the dominant power. The British were maybe even with the French. And nobody could have foreseen at the time that these colonies would emerge as their own nation. And in fact, the colonies, the 13 colonies, were not the most important part of the British Empire in the New World. That was the Caribbean. The majority of British settlers went to the Caribbean. And the Caribbean and North America had close ties. They're close to each other, so there's lots of shipping going on. And in fact, many Americans went from Europe to the Caribbean and then Caribbean to America. The Native American populations in the Caribbean islands had been pretty much completely wiped out. Now, Spain claimed all the islands, but they only had settlements on the large ones, so the English, the French, and the Dutch would move into the small ones. By the way, have you ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean? That whole pirate era, this is what it's about. The shipping in the Caribbean during this time and the raiding of the ships. When Spain goes to war with the Dutch, it occupied their fleet, and the British in the Caribbean were able to increase their presence. They'll take Antigua, St. Kitts, Jamaica, Barbados. They will first try to cultivate tobacco and cotton, but will eventually realize that sugar is the crop for these islands, and will get fantastically wealthy by growing sugar, which of course then gets processed into rum. Of course, sugar requires a lot of labor, and so there's an enormous amount of African American slavery pouring into the Caribbean, far more than ever goes to America. About 4 of every 5 residents of the Caribbean are black slaves. It is cheaper to replace the slaves than to take care of them. Few slaves lived more than 10 years. So basically the program was you just worked the slaves to death. You didn't really care about their health or longevity. And then you just bought more and brought them in as the ones you had died. The life expectancy for everyone, whites and blacks included, was well under 40 years old. It's going to be much lower for blacks. It was an unstable, violent place without any developed institutions. These were pretty much people on their plantations making money on their own. But the blacks do develop their own culture, this Caribbean culture that you may be familiar with today. And Caribbean slavery will become the inspiration and the model for slavery in the rest of the colonies. Now, the Spanish Empire is impressive. Mexico City is the major city. It's the capital city of the area, which is down here. There's more than 1 million people living in the Spanish Empire, 1 million Europeans living there. Which is way bigger than the population of the other European powers in the New World. North of the Rio Grande was considered unimportant. It was too hot and dry to do anybody any good, and the only people who really were there were missionaries trying to convert the Native Americans to Christianity. New Mexico was the biggest and most important part of the area north of the Rio Grande, with about 10,000 Spanish citizens there. Spain did build a series of forts along the coast of California in the 1760s, the Presidios, and established places like San Diego in 1769, San Francisco in 1776, the year of American independence. Los Angeles is established in 1781. But other than these missions set up to convert the Native Americans, there wasn't much activity into what is today the American Southwest. Native Americans who didn't die from the diseases were quickly enslaved, as we talked about last chapter. The French will explore the Mississippi River. They'll come all the way down the Mississippi River in 1682, which will scare the Spanish. And so the Spanish will begin to try to set up forts to prevent the French from getting into their land. And this leads to the founding of San Antonio in 1731 as a military outpost to stop French excursions. Spain also, as you can see here, controls Florida. They had been in Florida, in fact, since the 1560s. And there is constant tension between the Spanish, the French, and the British, who all, of course, border each other and therefore bump into each other. As I talked about in the last discussion, there's pirates all throughout here. That's Jack Sparrow and the Pirates of the Caribbean and all that. That's what it's about. The British particularly are always convinced that the Spanish are encouraging the Native Americans to rise up and attack the British, which may or may not be true. And the Spanish had banned slavery fairly early on and offered freedom to any slaves who could escape and get to Spanish territory and then were willing to convert to Catholicism. And they would then take these slaves and arm them and use them as an army to guard the northern border, which of course really angered the slaveholders in the South. In fact, Florida became so violent between the Native Americans and the runaway slaves, and then the British going after them, that almost all Spanish-born citizens left Florida and pretty much turned it over to the Native Americans who were there naturally. In 1732, a guy named James Oglethorpe, he was a military hero, and he will tour England's debtors' prison. At the time, if you fell into debt, they would just lock you up and throw you into jail. And these were terrible places, and they would throw in the wives and the kids who had nothing to do with the debt in with the debtors. And he thought this was horrible. And then he also pointed out that if you throw people who are in debt in prison, they have no way to make money to pay the debt back. And so what he wants is he wants to empty out the British debtors' prison, bring them to the New World, and create a state between South Carolina and Florida for the debtors to live. He says that way they could farm land, and at the same time they could be a buffer between Spanish Florida and the prosperous part of the colonies. So it's kind of sick, because the idea is if the Spanish invade, they would just be killing the debtors. So, that'd be all right, I guess. But that was the idea. And so this is what they did. Georgia was filled up with people brought out of prison. They limited the size of how much land they could hold. There was no drinking, and all kinds of other restrictions on their on what kind of behavior they could have. No slaves were allowed originally in Georgia, or Catholics. Apparently slaves and Catholics are just going to lead to trouble. But as tension with Florida waned, as relationships with Florida improved, these rules began to relax. Slavery was introduced, of course, and eventually it began running like any other colony, and it particularly developed very similar to the way South Carolina developed. I want to say a word about the western boundaries, particularly of the New England colonies in Virginia. They quickly came to dominate the Native American populations, but they also realized that those out there on the western fringe had to strike some sort of balance with the Native Americans. And while conflicts were still fairly common, there was still violence, they also began to trade with them, began to work out arrangements with them, divide land. You stay on that side of this river, I'll stay on this side of this river, and even get involved in each other's ceremonies and gift giving, and even some form of diplomacy. French fur trading began expanding, particularly into the south, which is, of course, going to lead to severe consequences later. But if you lived on the western part of the British colonies, you had to learn how to coexist with the French and the Native Americans. And so there arose this precarious balance that would collapse in the late 1970s as the British continued to push westward, which is ultimately going to be what causes the American Revolutionary War.